we're back on the StudyTube channel. Hey guys, I am Holly. If you don't know who I am, I've posted 3 videos now on the StudyTube channel, but I haven't yet spoken about biology, which is essentially my specialism. It's what I studied at university. I graduated last year from Cambridge and I did biological natural sciences essentially. I love biology. I specialised in cancer and immunology in my final year. And in today's video, basically, I wanted to give you guys a lesson or a little introduction to the immune system, because not only did I specialise in immunology in my final year, as I said, I also thought it was quite appropriate in this time to understand a bit about what's going on inside our bodies when we encounter an infection. I'm hoping that anyone, whether you've done biology or not, will be able to follow this thereabouts. And yeah, I also wanted to specifically focus on white blood cells, which is basically like our main armory within the immune system. I don't know how long we're going to be sitting here and talking about this. I could talk about biology for days, weeks, months, years. Honestly, I could sit here and just not stop talking. But I'm hoping that I might be able to get a whiteboard up here. That's why I'm going to creep over this side, because I just think diagrams are so important, especially when I'm trying to explain things and in biology, and that's what I use when I tutor in biology as well. I also talk quite quickly, so I'm going to try and slow my pace down a bit. We're just gonna like launch in. Okay, so yeah, the immune system, what is it basically? It is a system, I would say, of cells, tissues and soluble kind of biological molecules that collectively rid our bodies of pathogens. And a pathogen is something that causes disease. It's specifically a microorganism that causes disease, whether that's a bacterium, whether that's a virus, a fungus, but it's essentially something that causes disease. With viruses, the thing to remember is that viruses are not living. So unlike bacteria and fungi, for example, which are living, viruses aren't living, you know? They're very powerful despite not even being living things, but that's just something to keep in mind. So we have the immune system, and then we have these pathogens that are trying to essentially get through the walls of our immune system. The next thing to kind of talk about is this idea of inflammation. I assume a lot of people have heard of inflammation. It's a stereotypical response to tissue damage, and that tissue damage might be caused by a pathogen, but it might not. So we sometimes would say it might be non-sterile or sterile, depending on whether it's caused by a pathogen or not, respectively. Inflammation is characterized by 4 things: redness, swelling, pain, and heat. And the goal with inflammation essentially is to remove the agent that has caused that damage. So if it's a pathogen, we need to get rid of that pathogen. Then through the process of inflammation, we're then going to try and get rid of the dead and damaged tissues and then repair it thereafter. So we put everything back together and we establish like that healthy normal state again. So that's inflammation. It can be acute, which is where it's kind of temporary and short lasting. However, inflammation can be chronic and long lasting and go on for a very long amount of time. Okay, so now we're gonna basically get into the main part of this video about our white blood cells. They are the key cells of the immune system. They're essentially produced in our bone marrow. They're produced alongside our red blood cells and also the cells called megakaryocytes that form platelets, which are not themselves cells. But all of these cell types, white blood cells, red blood cells, and the cells that go on to form platelets, are all formed in your bone marrow from a single stem cell. It's called the hematopoietic stem cell. A stem cell is essentially, in basic terms, a cell that's going to go on to produce lots of other cells and at the same time keep self-renewing itself, if that makes sense. I'm hoping you're still following. So yeah, we have these white blood cells and they're also called leukocytes. If you hear a word in biology that has the word cyte on the end, C-Y-T-E, that means it's a cell, and leuko I think means white. So white blood cells are leukocytes. The way I'm going to kind of structure this and take you through it is I'm going to broadly divide the immune system into the innate immune system and the adaptive immune system. This is now very much an oversimplification. We know that the innate and the adaptive immune systems are not distinct entities. They very much blur together. However, we are going to use that because it helps give us a framework to talk through this. Okay, but first of all, obviously, what are the innate and adaptive immune systems? You may not have heard of those terms before. So taking one step back, I like to think of the immune system as having lines of defense, and we have kind of 3 lines of defense. The first one I'm not going to go into too much, but it's called our physical barriers. That's our first line of defense. So our skin, for example, is the perfect example. It's a physical barrier that most of the time prevents pathogens from penetrating unless we get a cut, for example. So that's our first line of defense, and it keeps out so many pathogens. We often take that for granted. And then our second line of defense is the innate immune system. That's what we also call the non-specific immune system. It responds immediately to pathogen entry, and it responds normally with the same kind of response, but it just differs in the magnitude depending on the scale of the invasion of the pathogen, if that makes sense. But the key thing, as I said, it's non-specific, and what that means is that it can distinguish between something that's a bacterium versus a virus versus a fungus, for example. So the different kind of broad categories of pathogenic agents or microorganisms, but it can't say what specific species it is. So is it salmonella or is it Mycobacterium tuberculosis? It can't distinguish what species it is or what specific type of virus it is. So that's what we mean when we say it's non-specific, but it's an amazing second line of defense as I'm defining it as here, because it's so rapid and it responds immediately, and that's what we need to start working on eliminating the pathogen or the tissue damage. Some people say it's not as sophisticated as the adaptive immune response, which I used to agree with, but having studied the innate response in quite a lot more detail at university, I would say they're both just as sophisticated as each other in just very different ways. So the adaptive immune response is therefore slower and it's highly specific. So it is recognizing exactly what this pathogen is, and that's why it essentially takes longer to develop, because it's got to recognize this pathogen and then produce cells and molecules that we'll talk about that are specifically targeting this pathogen. Another key thing about the adaptive immune response is that it leads to immunological memory, or this memory of the immune system. It remembers infection. So if we are reinfected with the same pathogen, the response will be a lot faster, and it's also a lot larger in size. So yeah, we're going to start with the innate immune cells, and the 2 I'm going to talk about first are called macrophages and neutrophils, because they are both phagocytes. These phagocytes, what they essentially do is they engulf a pathogen and then they break it down. It's not cellular eating, it's just engulfment and breaking down. So yeah, both macrophages and neutrophils are types of phagocytes. The distinction between a macrophage and a neutrophil, so macrophage tend to be longer lived, and they can also act as what we call an antigen presenting cell. Okay, some key words here, some new words. An antigen is anything that can stimulate an immune response. And you can think of it in this context as a part of the pathogen that is recognized by the immune system and that is triggering all of this inflammation and the activation of all these white blood cells. You know, it's telling them that we've got an infection. So these antigens, they can be presented or displayed on a macrophage. It kind of like goes around holding up the antigen like a flag. You can think of it as being like, this is the antigen that we're invaded with, this is what we need to recognize. So it is a phagocyte, but it can also act as an antigen presenting cell. We also have different types of macrophages, but I'm not going to go there because it's just too complex for this video. Okay, and then the neutrophils, on the other hand, they are not as long-lived. So they're quite short-lived cells. They die quite quickly. They are, however, the most abundant white blood cells in our blood. It's a gruesome way to think about this, but when we get a spot and we get a pussy spot, whenever you get pus, that lovely white substance, what is it? You know, what is pus? It's essentially dead pathogens with dead neutrophils. It kind of extrudes its DNA, and that's what we see as pus. Lovely, you know? So next time you have a spot and you see pus, that's what you're gonna think of. I'm gonna excuse any background noise just because my family seems to think that shouting is the same as talking when it's not. But anyways, final thing to say about neutrophils, they have this really distinctive nucleus The nucleus is essentially the part of the cell where the DNA is found, and it's described as a multi-lobed nucleus, and we can spot that really easily when we look under the microscope at white blood cells. Okay, so the next few types of cells of the innate immune response are the eosinophils and basophils. There's not really much to say about these types of white blood cells other than the fact that they specialize in defense against parasitic infections. So parasites, for example, a helminth worm, like a tapeworm, for example, they're much bigger pathogens, and so they require a different strategy to eliminate them. Phagocytosis, for example, isn't sufficient. So we have these eosinophils and basophils, which, amongst other things, eliminate parasites when those are the pathogen. NK cells then are another type of innate immune cell, and these are the ones that really help when we are infected with a virus, so a viral pathogen. I should have said, with a lot of these cells, they do have multiple functions, they do different things, but I'm just trying to highlight their most important or primary function. So an NK cell, what it essentially does mainly is it kills an infected host cell. So a cell that's been infected with a virus, because viruses have to use a host cell to replicate. And the way in which an NK cell recognizes this infected host cell can take place in kind of one of two ways. We have two types of models that help to explain that activation. Should I go into the details? Right, I might try and explain this quite briefly. An NK cell, essentially, when it sees a host cell, normally it's not activated under normal conditions when we're not infected, because it recognizes two types of receptors on the host cell, or a molecule that it binds to on the host cell. It recognizes two types: an inhibitory one that's inhibiting the NK cell, and stimulatory receptors, or those that are going to activate the NK cell. Normally, when we're not infected, there is an abundance or a surplus of those inhibitory molecules that the NK cell is binding to, and there's less of the stimulatory ones, so the NK cell is inhibited and it doesn't kill that cell, which is what we want. We don't want the NK cell to go around just killing our host cells for no reason. And then there are two models, as I said, to describe NK cell activation. In one, it's called the induced self model. The model name doesn't really matter, but what it's essentially saying is that in a cell, a host cell that is stressed, it will increase the expression of those stimulatory receptors, or those receptors that are going to tell the NK cell to kill it. And so the balances therefore shift. There's more of those activating receptors over the inhibitory ones, and so the NK cell, when it recognizes this stressed host cell, it's going to kill it and get rid of it. The other model is called the missing self model. I'm not going to explain why they're called the missing self and the induced self model. There is kind of a reason behind it, but I won't go into that. This model, on the other hand, states that the loss of the inhibitory receptors that are being expressed on that host cell will mean that the NK cell is activated, because if we lose the inhibitory receptors, we only have activating receptors or stimulatory ones left, and they're going to tell the NK cell to kill that host cell. I don't know if you will have followed that, and it's a bit advanced if you've never done biology before, but I hope that kind of filled some pieces in the jigsaw if you wanted to know. Okay, the last white blood cell of the innate immune system that I'm going to talk about is a mast cell. So mast cells are really important in allergic reactions, but that's kind of a bit different to what we're talking about now with pathogen infections. They are activated and they degranulate. They have these granules inside them that contain pre-formed substances, and one really important one of those substances is called histamine. I assume a lot of you have heard of histamine. We take antihistamines when we have hay fever, for example, hence why I kind of mentioned allergies. But a mast cell, when it recognizes an invading pathogen, it will degranulate immediately and release this histamine because it's pre-formed. So again, this is a really quick mechanism, and hence it's an innate immune response. Two key functions of histamine are to cause vasodilation. So vasodilation means there's an increase in blood flow to the surface of your skin. And then the second function of histamine is to increase vascular permeability. So if we break this down, vasculature means blood vessels and permeability means how permeable something is. So therefore, increasing vascular permeability is where we increase the permeability of blood vessels, so we allow more cells to get through the blood vessels. And this is important because it means that more white blood cells can enter the site of infection. So if you imagine we have a blood vessel and we have the infected tissue next to it. If we increase the permeability of that blood vessel, we can recruit more white blood cells because they're able to pass into the infected tissue more easily now that we've increased its permeability. Right, so we're gonna move on to the adaptive immune system and the white blood cells that belong to that part of the immune system. However, before we talk about those two types of cells, the B and the T cells, we need to talk about dendritic cells. And dendritic cells are the cells that do not fit in either the innate or the adaptive immune system very easily. They bridge the two. I mentioned before that macrophages can act as an antigen presenting cell, and dendritic cells are basically the most important antigen presenting cells. As I said before, they take an antigen, they present it on their surface and kind of flag up to the immune system that we have an infection. And the dendritic cells are very important because they essentially recognize this pathogen at the site of infection. They start to present that antigen. Okay, now someone's got in the shower, so we're gonna have shower background noise, but anyway, they recognize the pathogen at that site of infection. They then present that antigen through this process of antigen presentation, and then they drain to lymph nodes. So lymph nodes are all over our body, and those are the sites where we start to develop the adaptive response and we activate the B and T cells that I'll talk about in a second. So those dendritic cells are really bridging the innate and adaptive immune responses. They go to the lymph nodes, and it's in the lymph nodes where they normally tell the B and T cells what type of infection, what type of pathogen we're dealing with, because they're presenting the antigen, as I said, kind of like a flag. With the B cells, they are made in the bone marrow just like any other white blood cell, and they also mature there. However, T cells get their name because they are made in the bone marrow, but they mature in a part of our body called the thymus, which sits kind of behind our heart somewhere. I'm not sure why I'm pointing up here when our heart's kind of down here, but it's behind the heart is where we find the thymus, hence T cells. I don't know how much detail to go in with this. So our bone marrow produces a huge array of different B and T cells, and each different B or T cell can recognize a very unique or specific antigen or pathogen you can think of. So when a specific B cell is activated, because it's the one that say recognizes, I don't know, salmonella, because I mentioned it before, that B cell is going to be activated and it divides and it differentiates or specializes or matures into one of three types of cells. We get plasma cells, B memory cells, and B effector cells. The plasma cells are the types of B cells that secrete what a lot of people have heard of, the antibodies. Antibodies are soluble molecules that bind to this specific antigen and get rid of it using different mechanisms. A B memory cell is something that is responsible for our memory response, or when we are reinfected, it's the B memory cells that are activated really quickly, and then they stimulate a faster and larger immune response, or a secondary response is what we call it. Yeah, and then obviously with this secondary response, when we're reinfected with the same pathogen, it's unlikely that we then develop symptoms or the full-blown disease because it's a faster response and it's larger in size. The memory response is what a vaccine will kind of exploit, but I'm not going to talk about vaccines in this video. And then thirdly, the B effector cells kind of just have lots of different functions. We'll leave it at that. Finally, we need to finish with the T cells. So similar to the B cells, we have loads of different types of T cells, and they each recognize a very specific antigen or pathogen. When that specific T cell is activated according to the type of infection that we're dealing with, they again differentiate or turn into one of three different cell types. They can either become a T killer cell, a T helper cell, or a T memory cell. The T memory cells are essentially also involved in that memory or secondary response. The T killer cells, hence their name, they kill infected cells, so they don't kill the pathogen directly, they kill a cell that is infected with the pathogen. And then thirdly, these T helper cells, again, hence their name, they help other cells. They specifically help to activate our B cells. They also help the T killer cells, and they also help macrophages. So as you can kind of see, and we'll kind of finish here, I suppose the immune response is all highly interrelated. All of our white blood cells work together as a team. Teamwork is so important. Our immune system needs all of these different types of white blood cells to perform different functions. They then communicate and interact with each other, and they lead to a hopefully successful immune response that will get rid of the pathogen. Obviously, it's not as easy as that, because if it was, we wouldn't be riddled with all these diseases, these infectious diseases that we see in our society. But they all work together and they work very hard to try and eliminate pathogens. So yeah, I hope this was useful. I hope you learned something. I hope you kind of semi-followed along. Definitely like this video if you enjoyed it, if you liked the biology chat. I'm sorry the lighting was quite dull. It's because I'm filming at 8:21 apparently, so it's quite late in the evening. Leave your video ideas or topic suggestions down below. I will be bringing, and I've said this on my channel as well, I'm going to be hopefully bringing some more science content, biology content in particular, to my channel. You can obviously check my channel up below. I'll leave that link in the description box. As always, it's Holly Gabrielle. If you want to come and join me over there, you can do. But anyway, subscribe to the StudyTube channel as well. And yeah, we'll speak to you tomorrow in another video. I hope you are safe and well. Trust your immune system is what I'm going to leave you with. Bye!